Well, we are at 10:01. Good morning. I am Rebecca Fleischaker. I am Executive Director of Louisville Downtown Partnership. Thank you so much for joining our panel this morning. Our first one that we had a couple weeks ago, we were talking about downtown after the pandemic, a new paradigm in downtowns all across the world, really. And one of the things that came out of that was what we do in downtowns that help people hang out, and we call that social infrastructure. And so today we're very excited to be talking about that. I am going to hand it over to Barry Alberts, who will introduce our panelists. I will also be keeping an eye on the chat, so please do not be shy with any questions or comments, and we will share those after the three presentations and hopefully have a great conversation. So thank you again for being here. And Barry, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate it. Again, thank you all for joining us today. As we continue to move closer to crafting our strategy for downtown Louisville's growth and vibrancy over the next 10 years, we need to realize, as we discussed during our previous webinar, that the post-pandemic downtown will look and act much differently than our traditional downtowns have in the past. And we need to adapt to these changes. But at the same time, understanding that while these new realities present certain challenges to us, I think we all know what they are, they can also offer new opportunities. And perhaps we can revisit the way we approach the priorities for downtown Louisville. We touched upon a number of these in our initial conversation, including the increased importance of downtown as a residential neighborhood and a greater focus on downtown's public places and spaces, often called its public realm. And as part of that, we touched upon the importance of a strong social infrastructure, so much so that we decided to focus this second community conversation on just that. But what exactly do we mean by social infrastructure? Well, it's a good question, and one that we've asked today's panelists to address in some detail. But if you do a rudimentary Google search, you'll see lots of different definitions and examples. And while traditional infrastructure is most often associated with sewers, roads, bridges, and the like, our discussion today on the concept of social infrastructure will zero in on how it relates specifically to the health of downtowns in this post-pandemic world and its importance as an economic development asset. In their paper, The Social Infrastructure and the Public Life of Cities, urban geographers Alan Latham and Jack Layton define social infrastructure as, quote, the background structures and systems that allow social, economic, cultural, and political life to happen. In cities like Louisville, our downtown must be able to attract workers, residents, and visitors in large part because of just this system of social infrastructure. If it's weak or non-existent, there are lots of other choices away from downtown that people can choose to work in, to live in, and to congregate in. In her paper entitled Social Infrastructure, the Real Investment Cities Need, Tiffany Owens-Reed of Strong Towns makes a compelling distinction between two types of downtowns. Basic point. She goes on to point out that this kind of human visibility in a city with a strong fabric of social infrastructure does not occur by accident. Like any city, what you see and experience is a direct result of what you plan and design for. Cities dominated by cars are that way because the design and infrastructure investments of those cities prioritize vehicular movement. On the other hand, downtowns and urban areas dominated by people emerge because cities have intentionally invested in social infrastructure, the kind that prioritize the movement, visibility, and attractions of human beings to each other. Yet, she correctly points out, this kind of infrastructure gets far less attention or money or focus. It's often seen as a bit of fluff or, yeah, that stuff is nice, but not really essential. This is a mistake, especially in the post-pandemic world. Social infrastructure is what transforms cities and downtowns from merely a collection of buildings and roads to communities worth caring about, to places that people want to be part of, to live and work in, and to invest in. So how does a focus on social infrastructure become part of a downtown's economic development strategy? Does it have measurable benefits that can be demonstrated to policymakers, city councilors, investors, employers? And are there relevant examples of cities that have invested in its social infrastructure? All good questions. And fortunately, we have assembled a great panel that can help us begin to unravel these questions and provide perspective to us here in Louisville as we now revisit our approach to the significance of our social infrastructure system downtown. Leading us off will be August Williams-Eynon. He's a manager with the Urban Land Institute's Greenprint Center for Building Performance and the Urban Resilience Team, both housed in the ULI's Randall Lewis Center for Sustainability and Real Estate, which is dedicated to creating healthy, resilient, and high-performance communities around the world, working at the intersection of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Before joining ULI, Augie managed diverse urban environmental planning projects with the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and later the Center for Resilient Metro Regions at the University of Mass at Amherst. Coming from a background of environmental activism, Augie strives to center social equity and environment and empowerment while working towards a greener world. Augie received his BS in Environmental Studies from Cornell and a master's in regional planning from the University of Mass at Amherst with a concentration on local climate adaptation. Welcome to Louisville, Augie. Yuxiang Luo is a director at the James Lima Planning and Development Company, where he guides urban and economic development strategies for public, private, and nonprofit clients across North America. Yuxiang is committed to making cities and regions more competitive through economics, policy, and design. At James Lima Development, Yuxiang has worked on projects spanning 20 cities and counting, including the Regional Economic Opportunities Analysis and Workforce Development Strategy for Long Island, Economic and Funding Advisory for Open Space and Infrastructure projects in cities such as New York, San Jose, Jacksonville, Pensacola, and Asheville, and Real Estate and District Scale Planning in Texas, New York, Tennessee, Florida, and Alberta, Canada. We're pleased to have you join us as well today, Yuxiang. Finishing our panel is Karin Haley. Karin is the founding executive director of Indianapolis Cultural Trail, Inc., the nonprofit responsible for the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, an initiative that hopefully many of you have had the opportunity to experience during visits to our neighbor up on I-65. The 8-mile linear park in downtown Indianapolis has resulted in an initial economic impact of over $1 billion. I don't think that's a typo. I think we really mean $1 billion. Under her leadership, the organization launched the Pacers Bike Share program in 2014, and in 2021 broke ground on the first expansion of the Cultural Trail that will add approximately 2 miles to this now world-renowned linear park. Prior to leading the Cultural Trail, Ms. Haley was the City of Indianapolis's first director of the Office of Sustainability. She also has worked in the private sector for Aecon and Crow. Originally from Atlanta, Karin has lived in Indianapolis since 2008. She holds degrees from Georgia Tech and Indiana University. We look forward to you telling us the story of this impressive accomplishment, Karin. With that as background, let's kick off our panel with Augie Williams-Eynon. It's all yours, Augie.
Thanks so much, Barry. You know, I'm not sure I can provide a better introduction to social infrastructure than you just gave, so I'll do my best to layer on with those wonderful comments. It's great to be here with everyone. I'm really excited to talk through what it means to build social infrastructure into Louisville's downtown. And I really think that they are a critical tool for cities to consider, and really for all those who work in urban spaces, you know, all of us included, as a strategy for building these resilient and inclusive downtowns that we really need in response to the pandemic. So today, what I'm going to focus on mostly is how a city like Louisville can think about social spaces and infrastructure as it comes out of the pandemic and looks to strengthen its downtown core through that kind of thoughtful planning and development that Barry, you mentioned, and how to make a downtown that will truly last through kind of the shocks and the stresses that are ahead, whether it's pandemic related or otherwise. And to do that, I think we really need to take care of that social infrastructure that really does make it worth being a part of in the long term. And that process, you can kind of think about that as building social and economic resilience that drives value for residents and businesses and the public sector, really everybody, by building these attractive and cohesive and inclusive places to live in and to invest in. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And just so we know, everything that I'll be covering today is based on the recent report that we put out at the Urban Resilience team at the Urban Land Institute called Social Spaces, Resilient Communities. Here's the cover. I highly encourage you to flip through it to kind of build on what you learned today. There's a lot more in the report than what I can speak about in this time. But really briefly, just the major takeaways from the report that apply today are firstly that social infrastructure, as I mentioned, is a really critical component of resilient places that the public and the private sector both should consider integrating in development really everywhere. Secondly, we found that social infrastructure does have a very strong business case for investment, which I'll let Yuxiang cover. And thirdly, we found that social infrastructure can be designed not only into the public realm, which is the part of our cities that it's usually thought of as playing a role in, but really nearly any kind of private property as well. So this is not just a job for government to take care of. This is something that all of us can participate in and contribute to. And then finally, we found that social infrastructure is most successful and durable when it's inclusive and sustained. It takes investment, it takes maintenance, it takes proactive programming, and it takes a thoughtful approach to social equity. So what is social infrastructure? Barry, you gave a great introduction, and some of us may have heard the term. Some of us may be experts in it already. Some of us may be new to it. The definition that we use at the Urban Resilience Program, that's kind of an easy one, is that social infrastructure is the physical we use to gather and to build community and to build relationships. It's the places that we go to socialize, that we go to get to know each other, to have fun and have a vibrant social life. And we use these places every day, even if we don't spend a ton of time thinking about them. Different types of spaces can be considered social infrastructure, but really, broadly speaking, many agree that they can include spaces like commercial or third places, like your cafes, restaurants, bars, even places like big markets or smaller places like barbershops and salons, street vendors. Green spaces and parks are a really commonly thought of type of social infrastructure. This is, your playgrounds, your community gardens, your sports fields, your natural spaces, your larger city parks, or the cultural trail that Karin will speak on. Then we have things like gathering areas and open spaces that are not necessarily green, but still serve a really important purpose for folks to get together. These are your plazas, your courtyards, even things like lobbies and atriums within buildings. These can be important spaces for folks to bump into each other and make connections. And then we have spaces of transit and mobility. So these are our streetscapes, our sidewalks, our walking trails. These are often kind of underlooked types of social infrastructure. We usually like to focus on places that are destinations, but places that get us from point A to point B can be vibrant and pleasant and attract people to downtown as well. Then some folks, not all, like to include kind of community facilities in their thinking about social infrastructure. These are our, community support networks and spaces, whether that's for providing things like childcare or healthcare, folks that work on kind of employment centers, anything that's kind of a nonprofit center that's open to the public. These can include things like resilience hubs, which may be a new term. We can dive into that more later on. There's publicly managed spaces. These are some of the most kind of discussed and often thought of types of social infrastructure. Some of the folks who have popularized what social infrastructure means to a downtown, like Eric Kleinenberg, sociologist, loves to talk about libraries as kind of palaces for the public. These are places where they serve a ton of people, they bring a ton of folks together, provide a ton of different services. Museums and schools can also play some of these roles. And then lastly, places of worship. A lot of folks rely on these as some of their main forms of social infrastructure on a daily basis. So, we've touched on this briefly, but in thinking about, why social infrastructure matters to us, I think that the pandemic really showcased the importance of social infrastructure in cities around the world, partially by showing just how much we missed certain kinds of spaces when they had to close, whether that was, our favorite restaurant or cafe or, our art venue. But also just by showing the steps that could be taken really quickly in an emergency to make sure that our cities still had places to get together and that our cities and downtowns still thrive despite the challenging circumstances. So ULI released a report called The Pandemic in the Public Realm in the midst of the shutdowns that profiled cities around the world and showed just how much governments and businesses, nonprofits, private citizens were doing in cities of all sizes around the world to create places for people to connect despite the risk of COVID. And this included a ton of different actions, whether it was supporting local businesses and repurposing outdoor spaces, mostly in your streets and parking areas for things like dining and other activities, closing streets to cars so that people could walk and bike safely, developing these kind of quick placemaking and public art projects, and then innovating in parks and other kinds of open spaces to alleviate fears of crowding and provide more options for folks to get to safe and accessible open space and relieve some of the stress that we were all feeling. And obviously, many of these actions were temporary, they weren't lasting, but they were really broadly popular. And it, I think, showed just how much creative energy there is to improve our downtowns, especially when we remove some of the barriers that we've put up through these complicated regulatory and approval processes. And we're not in the same stage of the pandemic now as we were when some of these actions were being taken. But I think the after effects of the pandemic that many downtowns are facing, whether Louisville or otherwise, I think will require the same kinds of creativity and attention to social infrastructure that we brought back in 2020 and 2021. So, having talked through how important social infrastructure is for downtowns, we can spend a little bit of time thinking about how it actually works. I think social infrastructure builds resilient and inclusive downtowns in two main ways. Firstly, it builds resilience in kind of a broader sense by creating these vibrant and livable places that people will always want to be in and want to spend dollars in. And second, it makes sure that those resilient downtowns are also inclusive. So by making space for everyone to take part, it means that all of our communities can contribute to and benefit from a stronger downtown. And so how does it accomplish those goals? I think firstly, and perhaps most importantly, as Barry said, it attracts people. Places with high quality social infrastructure are more interesting, more exciting, more rewarding to live in, and they also drive economic growth. Studies by organizations like Smart Growth America have shown that places with rich social infrastructure that is situated in walkable environments only represent 1% of the landmass in the top 35 metro areas in the US, but they create nearly 20% of the country's real GDP. And these places also attract today's job talent, especially now that so many so-called knowledge workers have freedom of choice in where they live due to kind of a hybrid work environment. And then by presenting places people find engaging and beautiful and pleasant, those places will remain activated and in demand in all conditions. Secondly, so that's number one, attracting users. Secondly, social infrastructure can reduce the underlying stresses that make especially low-income communities and communities of color, other marginalized communities, more vulnerable by meeting their needs. Social spaces offer these communities what one of our interviewees for the report called spaces for survival, where folks can connect and support each other, meet community needs by leveraging the local assets that they already have and social networks that are in place, and then bounce forward, not just bouncing back after something difficult happens, but bouncing forward by working to transform systems that might be causing that inequity. So you could consider, for example, excuse me, a resilience hub that does workforce training, or an office building that includes spaces for nonprofits, or a retail complex that prioritizes local businesses. And meeting these needs is really important, we found, to making sure that no one is held back from making downtown a better place. And having these kinds of spaces downtown make sure that everyone in our community feels like they have a place there. Thirdly, we learned that social infrastructure supports community responses to shock events, whether that's pandemics or acts of violence, or any other kind of sudden, difficult event that really challenges the resilience of a city. And these spaces in those times enable folks to come together and to share resources, to organize recovery activities, and to really maintain their emotional attachment to this place that might get a little shaken up after something like this happens. For example, we're hearing out of Hawaii that social infrastructure has been crucial in the recovery after the wildfire that hit Maui. And people have been gathering in coffee shops and places of worship to find comfort, find assistance, and support. Social spaces really become these places for communities to organize their responses to difficult circumstances and to get to know each other well enough, to know who to check on, for example, in an emergency, or to build more inclusive community development strategies. And these spaces at a wider level, beyond just kind of residents connecting to each other, they can also function to better connect civic organizations, community groups, businesses, and government bodies, and ensure that all of the stakeholders that are invested in downtown are coordinating on long-term planning for development, and they're incorporating a lot of different voices in the process. And then finally, we learned that social infrastructure increases general health and well-being. When communities are less weighed down by chronic health issues, whatever those are, not only can they enjoy downtown more, but they can also reduce the strain on public services and free up government funding to focus on other kinds of investments. And obviously, social infrastructure, whether if it's outdoor spaces or otherwise, also provides places like parks and gyms where people can exercise, they can connect to nature, they can reduce stress. Not only that, but simply just connecting to other people and having strong social relationships just as a baseline, whether we're exercising or not, makes us healthier. Studies have found that stronger social networks can reduce obesity, can reduce stroke, cognitive decline even, and support healthy behaviors such as decreased smoking and alcohol use. And then lastly, since as a member of the urban resilience team, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that these spaces are also really important for mitigating environmental hazards. For example, you could think about a waterfront park, which I know Louisville has been working on developing a really great one, offer places for events and gatherings, but they can also help shield neighborhoods from floods or cool off downtowns during heat waves. And similarly, just having spaces to organize and coordinate is just as important to recover from a tornado, for example, or a bad storm as it is to recover from other kinds of socioeconomic shocks. Communities always need strong relationships in place when they're dealing with any kind of risk. So with all that under our belts, how can downtowns build strong social infrastructure? We learned that the public and private sector have a lot of different options for how to integrate social infrastructure into downtown areas. And there are a few principles that stood out to our team in the course of research. Firstly, we found that you really need to be intentional about using space for social gathering. It doesn't happen by accident, as Barry, you mentioned. It needs to be planned and integrated from the start. And really, every project can incorporate some form of it, even in buildings that are already built and on operation. For example, you could use building lobby to host a pop-up health clinic for community members, or you could use that lobby to coordinate relief efforts after a storm. For downtowns, this can look like using existing public space differently, not for cars, but for people. We want to be building complete streets, enhancing our landscaping, providing seating, and generally making public space more comfortable for more kinds of uses and just making more of it, whether that's playgrounds, parks, plazas, pedestrian boulevards. I also recommend paying particular attention to designing public space with specific users in mind that are often left out in terms of how we think about our public space. For example, how can we make these places safe for women? Or how can we make them fun and playful for children and teens? How can we make sure that they're universally accessible? This really makes sure that everyone in the community can enjoy and benefit from a vibrant downtown. Secondly, the second kind of main strategy or principle we found was to use the spaces in between. People often gather in these areas of connection that surround and knit together our buildings and other kinds of destinations in a downtown. And we can use things like walkways, streetscapes, entrances, seating areas, and more to our advantage by making them feel comfortable and like places people feel like lingering in. Even just as simple as putting a bench in front of a common entranceway can accomplish this. People will start talking to each other. They'll start getting to know each other. And we really need to be thinking about how the public and the private sector can design these spaces into new development and think about, are there underutilized areas that could be improved and activated, whether that's streetscape parking lots, lobbies, atriums, entrances, whatever it is. How can these spaces be incentivized or even required in new private projects? And then lastly, mixing uses. This is kind of, it feels maybe a little bit been there, done that, but mixing uses in a single project or throughout the neighborhood is what brings different users together at different times of day for different purposes. And it encourages people to cross paths where they otherwise might miss each other. And we found that mixed use projects are not only more dynamic, but they're also more flexible and they're more resilient to changing demand for kinds of spaces that we need. So we can be thinking about having a highly varied and highly dense combination of spaces that ensures that someone will always be there, whether that's a mix of housing with mixes of different income levels. Barry talked about making a downtown a residential neighborhood. That's critical. Mixing in different types of commercial spaces, whether that's retail, entertainment, hospitality, offices, free public spaces. This is what creates those organic connections and really gives rise to the unpredictable exchange of ideas and people that cities are able to produce when they're thriving. On the other hand, separating uses one by one is what keeps that from happening. This is absolutely oversimplifying things, but forgive that for a moment. You could think about it as you're trying to create a delicious meal. Maybe it's a soup. When you're cooking, do you separate all your ingredients out into individual bowls and cook them and then eat them one at a time? No, you throw them all in the pot in the right proportions, and you build these complex and surprising new flavor combinations. It seems like common sense, but it's surprisingly not what we've done with land use for a really long time. We've kept our housing separate from our offices, from our retail, from our manufacturing, and there were reasons for that when it was, when land use law was being developed 100 years ago or so. But it means that if one ingredient goes missing, like downtown offices, for example, that bowl that we've put that ingredient in will just stay empty. So we need to mix these uses to make sure that they can all interact with and support one another and create something unique that can still be delicious if we're missing an ingredient for a while. So as a few examples, I've been talking about this kind of at a broad level, but social infrastructure can also happen in individual buildings and sites. And we found that developers in particular have a major role to play in doing this. This is the Taylor Street Apartments in Chicago. It's a fantastic example of how to be intentional in using spaces for social infrastructure. So this is tying back to that first strategy. This is a mixed use, mixed income development that achieved a really fascinating blend of public sector affordable housing, market rate apartments, an on-site branch of the Chicago Public Library, and it preserved a pre-existing on-site community garden. The building is also super sustainable, and it uses a combination of design strategies to reduce its energy use, to increase the amount of light that comes into the building, to manage the stormwater that falls on the site, and to boost biodiversity. For example, using this green roof and this community garden also serves that purpose. And communal living for residents and kind of community building features for the neighborhood are integrated together with each other. It has features for residents like an outdoor deck and a community room and a fitness center. And the library on the first floor kind of reactivated its location on an important corner with these glass windows and these really tall ceilings that connect to the street and improve sight lines in and out of the building. And the library has amazing programming, whether that's lectures or workshops and book clubs. It has play and learning spaces for children, a media space for teens, and workforce development spaces for adults. So this is a wonderful example of how a project can really intentionally combine a huge variety of indoor and outdoor community-oriented social infrastructure into one site. And then we've been talking about this at the neighborhood level. Here's a great example here as well. This is the Mariposa District in Denver, Colorado, and they took an aging public housing community that had been suffering from high rates of crime, lacked access to healthy living features compared to a lot of other neighborhoods in Denver. They went through an extensive redevelopment process, and the design prioritized enhancing the streetscapes, widening the sidewalks, adding more lighting, extensive tree planting and seating to promote comfortable walking and social interactions. They added public plazas throughout the neighborhood with community events and festivals and activated those with large public art installations and murals. They narrowed a few streets to facilitate safer biking, along with new landscape areas and art to enhance kind of the safety and walkability and the neighborhood character. And then they embedded a network of parks and open spaces throughout that serve a range of ages and cultures, from these highly popular community gardens that you see to playgrounds and picnic areas. And then, really interesting, this is not something that's done that often. Afterwards, they went back and asked residents, most of whom had managed to stay in the neighborhood, how they felt about the new neighborhood. And those surveys overwhelmingly identified a strong sense of belonging, a safer environment, and they measured the crime rates for the few years after this was completed, and they actually were able to reduce crime rates by 30% over the course of 6 years or so. So designers noted that kind of the whole feel of the space had changed kind of dramatically, and people were sitting outside, they were saying hello to each other, they were beginning to feel a sense of ownership and connection to the neighborhood. So this is what's possible, I think, when you approach social infrastructure in the public realm with some really careful planning and execution. And then finally, in terms of mixing uses, that third strategy we identified, this photo is a great example of kind of public investment, creating a mix of social infrastructure. This is the Oasis Terraces in Singapore. It's a project of the government's Housing and Urban Development Board, and it includes a healthcare clinic. 30% of the space goes to that. It also includes a retail and dining center, this shaded community plaza that you see here, alongside gym spaces, community gardens, learning spaces. It's really interestingly, it's cooled by natural ventilation and a thickly vegetated facade, which is really important in Singapore's climate, which is obviously very hot and humid. And also its ground floor is elevated because it's right next to a nearby river, and otherwise it would be vulnerable to flooding. And this whole thing is meant to kind of be the social heart of this new developing neighborhood there. And the variety of programming and services that's being provided, I think, ensures that it'll be in use throughout the day. So as you're thinking about your social infrastructure for downtown, I will leave you with these criteria that we identified for assessing how well social infrastructure is doing. Obviously, this will look different in every place, and it will be up to Louisville to determine what this feels like for them. Firstly, we want to prioritize social equity and access. We know from social science research that those who are most affected by socioeconomic shocks, environmental shocks, and stresses are low-wealth communities, communities of color, elders, women, socially isolated residents in particular. That's a huge thing. People with different abilities. Strong social networks and infrastructure are going to help create these kind of tight-knit communities that can provide resources to these folks and be designed and maintained with their communities in mind. Secondly, you want to reach for multiple co-benefits. This is about making sure that every dollar that's invested in social infrastructure brings the most bang possible, because these spaces can bring a number of different environmental and social and economic benefits. For example, you could think about a mixed-use multifamily development with maybe a first-floor grocery store and a publicly accessible park out front or community garden. So this is increasing attainable housing supply. It's creating employment opportunities and food access. It's strengthening stormwater management and heat island reduction, boosting biodiversity. And this environmental piece, lastly, is really critical. We need to make sure that our social infrastructure is prepared for extreme weather, because if it's too hot to go downtown, all the social infrastructure in the world will not bring people there. And the same thing applies to storms. You know, if our downtowns cannot handle heavier rain and they're always getting damaged and put out of commission, it's not going to be able to draw people in. And that bill from those lost visits and those repairs are going to add up really quickly. Thirdly, we want to be designing with communities and for authenticity. As one of our interviewees put it, authenticity is everything, and people can spot it a mile away whether something is real or not. So when you're incorporating social infrastructure into downtown, community engagement behind that process is really key so that we can build local culture and history to create these authentic and distinctive places that stand out from the rest. And then finally, you've got to prioritize maintenance and programming. Maintenance is what makes sure a space stays welcoming and safe and able to benefit downtown throughout its lifetime, while programming and activation, that's the piece that makes people keep coming back. And this is partially about widening the circle of who's responsible for caring about these spaces and building connections between residents and tenants and businesses and property owners and government actors, and making sure that everyone really feels a stake in keeping up the public realm. So that's all for me. I've spoken enough. Again, there's much more in the report on each of these topics, and especially about how to apply these to environmental hazards in particular. But for now, thank you so much for joining, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later on.
Thanks, Augie. That was a great overview. I think a good lead into our next speaker, Yuxiang Luo. And I'm going to actually do Yuxiang's slides. So give me a minute to share my screen and see if we can make this work. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Barry, and good morning, everyone. My name is Yuxiang. I am director at JLP+D. It is a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Augie, for the very great presentation. We at JLP+D have been inspired by the great work that ULI has been leading. Next page. Many of you here actually, I think, have heard from our company president, James Lima, just a few weeks ago in the first webinar. But for those of you who are less familiar with JLP+D, we are an urban strategy consulting firm with a national portfolio from coast to coast, working with developers, government agencies, downtown associations, nonprofits, and also foundations. Next page. And at JLP+D, we specialize in the economics of place, thinking about what type of spaces has more value and what kind of funding and policy strategies can be used to build those good places. And for me personally, I have been working on the economic side of urban development for the past years. And I studied institutional economics specifically, which is the study of how people collaborate in economic transactions. And those include, of course, real estate and also urban planning projects. So it's very exciting to be here today for this conversation. And I hope to contribute to this panel by discussing the specific business cases of social infrastructure. Next page. So as an overview, I will discuss how, in 3 different ways, social infrastructure is valuable to developers and also other stakeholders economically. And those are financial considerations, risk control in planning and entitlement, and also long-term asset management and stewardship. Next page. So the first reason developers and all downtown stakeholders should care about social infrastructure from a financial perspective is about, again, the finance itself. For JLPD's clients today, we see a very different market landscape than just a few years ago. Now, when people have more choices to live and work anywhere, it is not just the location or the centrality of location that decides the fate of real estate. It is the experience of place that matters the most. For both residential and commercial sectors, having places where people want to come and be with each other is more important than ever, especially right now when isolation and polarization are the norm. That power of social spaces to attract people actually translates to foot traffic and higher rents that sometimes can break or make a pro forma. In JLPD's advisory work, we quantify the economic benefits of park investments for developers and governments alike. For example, as you see here on the screen that Barry is showing, this is a project that we did in North Carolina. Our client was a city agency. They own properties in downtown, surrounded by all these great civic and commercial assets, and they're trying to decide if they should build a park on that land that they own, or they should sell the land to a developer. So from the business perspective, if the return is the net proceeds and also the additional property tax value, then the city should, of course, sell the land. But from our quantitative research, we actually find that a new downtown park would increase the value of park adjacent real estate by 10% and also significantly increase the interest of developers for nearby redevelopment in the district. Next page. And therefore, we've built a model for the city to test whether they can actually split the land, where part of the land is a new park and the other part is for the development. And the new park can increase the value of nearby development, thereby hitting a sweet spot of maximized value. Next page. And eventually, as you see in the renderings here, the City Council unanimously approved a master plan based on the concept of having both park and development, knowing that the value enhances each other. So that is, say, the most intuitive level of how social spaces can help make money, as we see that new amenities can increase market demand, especially for ground floor commercial uses that have been really struggling since the pandemic. Next page. The second aspect about how social infrastructure is useful for urban development is regarding project planning and entitlement. As we all know, real estate and urban planning are very expensive, not just like say the hard cost of construction, but really the transaction cost that occurs because of the multiple parties involved who often do not agree with each other. I think we can all relate to that. And this plays out the most significantly during the entitlement process, when developers, communities, and also government agencies make their different voices very, very consequential and loud. So in JLPD's research and project work, we treat social spaces as a uniquely potent tool to align interest and reduce the cost of entitlement. Next page. I'll give you one just quick example today about like how that played out in one of the JLPD's portfolio. So we have a project in a city in Florida where our client is a private organization that owns 50 acres of improved land, and they're seeking redevelopment opportunities, mostly residential. The area is very large. On the one side of the area that you see on the screen, you are close to a very wealthy historic district. But on the other side, you are in an area with greater poverty. So the neighborhood and the government, they are both following the process very, very closely because of the size and the potential impact of such a big development for the entire city. In this case, JLP+D helped the client created a development framework that seeks to balance market opportunity with political viability. And one of the key strategies is to create a town square organized around a new neighborhood park and community healthcare facility with workforce training space. So next page. This is a visual about what that park can look like. And actually, this is an existing image about one part of the land that the developer owned that's already a park-like area with the trees. Next page. And this is a potential space that the workforce training space next to the healthcare facility can look like. That's also nearby the park as an anchor of the town square. So next page. And this is a overview about what the development framework can look like. And for the developer, this park and also the town square idea is convincing because it is strategically positioned in a location that's actually more remote within the 50 acres, hence driving the market demand for a corner that is otherwise less desired. And for government and the community, putting the social structure, putting the social infrastructure as a key component of the development vision also shows goodwill from the developer, and it mitigated a lot of anxiety in the community. So actually, the city council was very supportive of that idea, and they also approved resolutions that will contribute to funding to build the park. And I think about this project a lot because I think we can all relate to this. In the planning and entitlement process, sometimes government, they mandate certain community benefits to be part of the package, like a new park or a new community center. But what we are seeing more and more often is that in certain situations with a lot of existing political anxiety and also entitlement uncertainty, the developer's proactive move to include social infrastructure can be a smart business strategy. Next page. The third and also the last point that I want to make today is to talk about long-term operations. And we know that long-term operations and stewardship really rely on social infrastructure. Those in the asset management space understand this dynamic that a project's life does not end when the construction completes. It has only begun. The operations and management is also not a one-person job. It relies not just on the property managers, but also on tenants, business associations, and also users themselves. This is where trust, and more broadly speaking, the social cohesion among community becomes really instrumental for success. Because if people don't know how to work with each other, the new ground floor plaza will be dirty, and also the shops and the parks will also be empty. At JLP+D, we really try to work with city clients and also nonprofit organizations on this very issue of stewardship and governance. For example, in South Carolina, we helped created one city's first downtown management organization to work with property owners and developers as the stewards of public spaces and also as a champion for development. In another Californian city, we have been working with downtown stakeholders to explore the mechanisms for them to contribute either their sweat equity or financial capital to the stewardship of the largest downtown park, which in turn can drive our development value. Next page. So in that Californian project, we helped the park organization develop an equitable programming strategy that maximizes community involvement. And these are an overview of those strategies about how people can contribute different kind of programming and also policy ideas to make the park more equitable. Next page. And we also go on to project how additional funding can be flowing and also unleashed based on the increased community and business participation. And we are happy to share more details of that work in another setting. Next page. So to conclude and also to summarize JLP+D's approach to social infrastructure, I would like to emphasize the ability of social spaces to build and enhance trust among people. And in planning and development, trust is everything because you need trust to make entitlement less costly You also need trust to ensure high quality long-term management that will involve multiple parties. And as we see in our work across the country, it is that kind of trust among different stakeholders that make value creation a true possibility. And this concludes the JLP+D presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Yuxiang. I think it's really interesting to hear about a financial benefits of these things. We all know from a social point of view how important they are, but making a case particularly to policymakers, the work that you guys are doing is pretty interesting in terms of bringing that aspect as well. So now we're going to turn it over to Karin Haley from the Indianapolis Cultural Trail.
Thank you. Yep, I'm trying to pull up my screens for you all. I always enjoy hearing from people who, like Augie and Yuxiang, about all the, you have time and capacity to think about all these big problems. And in my world with the cultural trail, I'm in it every day. And so it's always a fresh breath of fresh air to hear about things that are happening outside of Indianapolis. I think I'm sharing. Can you all see my screen? Okay, great. So I'm really excited to be here speaking with you all today. Thank you so much for the invitation, Rebecca and Barry. And I just love Louisville. So I want you all to know that you've got a great city, a great downtown, so many wonderful neighborhoods. And I look forward to visiting every time I get the opportunity. You all have a really great bones and a lot of great things to build off of. So I'm happy to be a part of this discussion. As Barry said, we're fortunate that with the Cultural Trail, you all can be in Indianapolis in a few hours. And I'm sure many of you have been here and seen the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, a legacy of Gene and Marilyn Glick, before. It's an 8-mile linear park that connects really every place you want to go in downtown Indianapolis. And it's unique because of how it's built and how it's governed. And how we work very closely with the city as a nonprofit organization, but we are in fact separate from the city. We don't receive any funding from the city of Indianapolis. The city in the original 8 miles wasn't a funding partner. They were definitely a thought partner and a true partner, but they didn't have any financial investment in the Cultural Trail. But as we have expanded and are continuing to expand, they have definitely seen and believe in the value of the Cultural Trail and have been an investment partner of ours in our expansion that's currently under construction and another one that is in design. And so I think, using the power of the Cultural Trail to show the impact on community, the impact on economic development, on this social infrastructure that we're talking about is really one of the reasons why the city is such a close partner of ours, and why people continue to come to learn about the Cultural Trail to see how they can build their own version in their own communities. So I have a few slides. I will probably glance through a few of them to focus on some, but it started about cultural districts and connecting cultural districts. And I just think that's important as we think about this conversation about social infrastructure. The Cultural Trail did not start out as an economic project. It did not start out as a private development. It has spurred private development for sure. It has spurred public development for sure. But it started out with the fact that we wanted to connect people to our cultural districts, which was really about connecting people. So you can see a little bit how this plays out in real life on a map of downtown. I'll get to more of this in a minute. But I just thought it was important to start off with, I think social infrastructure was really at the heart of the Cultural Trail's founding and a big part of why it's so successful and continues to thrive today. So this is a map of where we are now. The two areas that you can see in blue, it's kind of in the corner and on the bottom of the page are where we're currently under construction. So you can see a little bit of our expansion footprint. And that circle at the middle is the geographic heart of the city and the state. It's Monument Circle, for those of you familiar with Indianapolis. And also a little bit about this organization. So both our previous speakers spoke about the importance of governance and maintenance and programming. And those are things that we do as the nonprofit responsible for this amazing public asset. So I can't underscore enough about how those two pieces are integral for any long-term success of any public benefit project or public benefit investment. And again, going back to what this is all about for us here in Indianapolis, it's that connection, the cultural connection. So building a cultural trail, a linear park that also infuses art to make it dynamic and something, a place for people to want to visit, to see what's new, to see what's happening. And then similarly, the investment in nature and beauty. One of the previous speakers mentioned, what are we doing to create reasons for people to linger? What are we doing to create reasons for people to want to spend more time in these public places? And for us, the nature and the beauty and the art are a big part of why people linger and why the cultural trail continues to be a magnet for people and businesses, both large and small. And then making it accessible. For us, accessibility is not just about making sure that the cultural trail is available and usable by people of all mobilities, but also that it's available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which is why we include the picture with lights and the picture with snow removal. As we think about making sure it's accessible, it's not just about the types of people or the types of modes that can use the cultural trail, but it's about making it accessible for people of all abilities, no matter the time of day, no matter the time of year. And I think the reason why we're here is that the cultural trail is so much more than a trail. It started out as just an idea to connect cultural districts and to be a place to make it easy and beautiful for people to walk. But it's become so much more than that. So here are some examples of our programming that we do along the trail. One of the photos is of an annual egg hunt we do, where it is really one of my favorite things that we do on the cultural trail because it attracts such a diverse community of people in Indianapolis, old and young, multi-generational, multi-language, and it's free. So I think that's also, as we think about how are we continuing to attract people to the cultural trail from our community engagement events, it's making sure that they're financially accessible and affordable to everybody. And we're able to do that by offering free programming. And we've also built community along the trail. So as you'll see in a few photos, in a few slides, a lot of development has occurred along the cultural trail and it has brought people, but it's people who also want to give back. And we have a very robust volunteer program that allows people who live in downtown. You might not think of downtown as a place to get your hands dirty and to dig in the dirt and to plant plants and to tree trim and things like that. Certainly a place where people always have the ability to pick up litter, but on the cultural trail, they're doing it and giving back to something that they use every day. We do a lot of work with corporate volunteer groups because they're located downtown, and post-pandemic, they're always looking for things to get people back into the office and to do some engagement opportunities with their team. And a lot of them give back and have team building volunteer events along the cultural trail because it's right outside their office. And it's also about the people. I'm not going to read these quotes to you. You can read that, but it talks about how the cultural trail is really a part of people's lives, and it is the cultural trail has really made us a face-to-face city in our downtown. It has allowed downtown neighborhoods to thrive. It has allowed downtown neighborhoods to have this new renaissance where they might not have. We brought the people, we brought the connection. And then what's happened along the edges of the cultural trail is really that neighborhood building, the community building, the local businesses that are thriving. And as a result, it's the places where people want to continue to invest and build more in our downtown. And the trail, it is a piece of infrastructure. It's not just a piece of social infrastructure. That's the great benefit of the cultural trails, the social infrastructure impacts. But it's actually a piece of infrastructure that people use for commuting. They use for exercise. They use for transportation. The picture that has the bike and the bus shelter, that's actually now home to one of our bus rapid transit stations. And so the cultural trail has allowed people to think a little bit more bigger and broadly about what transportation infrastructure can be. And they're demanding it in many other parts of Indianapolis. Speaking to people in Louisville and around the country about the benefits of the cultural trail, we do that just as much in our own city, where other neighborhoods are wanting to find out, how do we connect to the cultural trail? How do we talk to our counselors? How do we talk to our private businesses? How do we talk to our mayor's liaisons to find out how we can get infrastructure investment with connectivity and bike lanes and parks in our neighborhoods too? It's really exciting to see the cultural trail inspire other neighborhoods in Indianapolis, just as it's exciting to see it inspire people from around the world. And then more than a trail with our bike share program, again, it just fits into the transportation ecosystem of Indianapolis and the desire for people to connect in multiple ways to the cultural trail. But the bikes truly make it a part of our transportation infrastructure. So a little bit more about the programming that we're able to do along the cultural trail. It all comes back to community engagement and really reaching out to the neighborhoods adjacent to the cultural trail to find out, what do you want? This is really your cultural trail. It's our community's cultural trail and a place to celebrate the culture of Indianapolis. So we do that in a multitude of ways. This obviously is whiteboards, good old fashioned sticky notes. It's also, we go to a lot of neighborhood meetings. We have a team that is really, we hope, embedded within the community that uses the cultural trail so that we can learn and have relationships with the people who use the cultural trail, who live on the cultural trail, who live near the cultural trail, to find out how we can best serve them and continue to be that piece of social infrastructure for them. Again, some of the ways we do that are through community events, through live music, through our bike share program. For us, we really focus on the user experience, and that is a different type of experience depending on how you want to use the cultural trail. So we try to always keep in mind, first and foremost, the people who are using the trail on a daily basis, that they can get to work, that they can get to the grocery store, and then making sure that's a beautiful experience for them, an accessible experience. But then what can we layer on top to make it attractive and a place where people will come, not just for their transportation needs? And these are some of those examples. And recently, I think just from a pandemic perspective, because we knew we could be outside and it was safe to be outside, we really started leaning into our performative arts and culture programs along the cultural trail. For so long, we could not listen to music inside. We could not gather inside, and outdoor spaces, and in particular in Indianapolis, the cultural trail connects many of our city's outdoor spaces. Some are city owned, some are privately owned, but they welcomed us with open arms to say, cultural trail, help us. You've got the relationships with the community. You are the cultural trail. How can we start bringing people to some of these public gathering spaces along the cultural trail? And so it allowed us to think about our programming in different ways, where we had more space besides just the linear nature of the cultural trail. It's been really exciting to be on that journey with our team and with the community. And then the community and economic impact. A picture tells 1,000 words, and here's one of those photos. So in the picture on my left, where we have an empty lot, there's now a mixed-use multi-story building with a brewery and a co-working space in the ground floor and office spaces in the ground floor, and then obviously 3 to 4 floors of residential on top. And so the cultural trail has really been this economic and community driver that has brought more people to our downtown neighborhoods, because you can live in Indianapolis without a car because of the cultural trail. You can walk to your grocery store because of the cultural trail. You feel safe walking, it's lit, you can do it at night. And so really just thinking about those things that are might seem very simple, it really all comes together along the trail to make it a desirable place for people to live, work, and play. Another example of the kind of before and after some of the development, the newer building in this picture is actually also mixed income. It's a partnership with our housing authority, where I think it's about a quarter of the units in there are reserved for our low income neighbors. And Indianapolis has done a very good job of advocating for and requiring affordable housing when it does new developments. And I think that's really key as we think about the infrastructure the cultural trail provides. It allows people who not just don't have a car by choice, but maybe can't afford to have their own vehicle. It makes it easy and simple to live in downtown and to thrive really without that car that is, for better or worse, so synonymous with our city and with many mid-sized cities in the country. And then again, just kind of more examples of that economic impact, and really that economic impact that's building neighborhoods and building communities along the cultural trail. And Barry was right, it's $1 billion. And that's the increase in assessed property value. And the assessed property value is key because that change in assessed property value goes back to our partners at the city. So in terms of making that argument to policymakers, to city leaders, to private developers, there's definitely a huge return on investment for the cultural trail, especially since it's been built with philanthropic investment, not necessarily public dollars. And then as we think about the future, now, as I mentioned, the city is a financial investment partner in the cultural trail. And so we commissioned that economic development study looking at data from 2007 to 2014, we're about to embark on another one because we know that the impact is so much greater than it was in those years almost a decade ago. And so we took that and shared it with our partners at the city and said, we think we can do more of this, but we need your support. And so the city committed $5 million to our first expansion to help with the design and construction. And this is a photo of the groundbreaking that we had a couple of years ago, and it's currently under construction. This is a connection to the Madam Walker Legacy Center on historic Indiana Avenue in Indianapolis. So again, staying true to the heart of connecting to our city's cultural and cultural institutions. And then this is not too far away. It's better connecting one of our major employment centers. There are 3 hospitals along this stretch of road, but it will also connect to 3 other trails and greenways that come into the northwest side of our downtown. So allowing neighborhoods that are not downtown to connect to the cultural trail through the cultural trail and get to the rest of our city is really key, that going back to the theme of connection. And this is another one more in the heart of our kind of convention visitor area, where we've got our Lucas Oil Stadium and our convention center that are in this image, and wanting to provide, that great experience for people who visit, not just our residents, because we know that if you visit, you'll want to come back, and maybe one day you'll see yourself living in Indianapolis. And then finally, this is something we announced earlier this year. It's a second expansion of the cultural trail. And this is truly, this particular piece is a partnership between our state, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, and the city of Indianapolis. There's a lot of development going to occur on the west side of our White River. And this is truly an example of how the cultural trail is being used as an economic tool to attract development, but also to connect the neighbors and the residents who live on the west side of our river. Just like highways, rivers are also barriers. And the bridge, this area has not had a bridge forever. And so this connection will not only connect the new development and headquarters of Elanco Animal Health. They're going to have their world headquarters on the west side of the river. But from a neighborhood standpoint, the neighborhood has been asking for this connection, and being able to call some of the residents and neighbors that we have relationships with in this part of town and say, guess what? We're going to make it happen. The Indianapolis Cultural Trail is coming to West Indianapolis was truly an amazing experience, because they said it's just really going to change in a positive way. They could never have dreamed that something like the Cultural Trail could ever come to West Indianapolis, and they're thrilled with what that means for their neighborhood. And this is my last slide, just kind of tongue in cheek if you read it. I mentioned, as you know, we're a nonprofit. We're set up this way. We're set up to be flexible and work outside of the city to fundraise and to be creative and to do programming. But at the same time, if we could collect 75 cents, I can't imagine. If we collected a penny for every person who used the cultural trail every day, we would be quite a well-sustained nonprofit organization. So just thinking about, again, tongue in cheek, you've got to think about how all of these public investments and social infrastructure investments are funded for maintenance and programming and public use for the long term, not just when the ribbon is cut. And that to me is really the legacy of the cultural trail.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. And again, this is 2 hours from downtown Louisville. So if any of you haven't been up there to see it and experience it yourself, it's just a magnificent undertaking, and the results speak for themselves. But you've done a great job up there. We've got a little bit of time. We do want to open it up for questions. If you do have a question, enter it into the chat, and we'll direct it to the right people. I also want to encourage the panelists to, if they have questions for each other, please feel free to jump in and do that. I will use my moderator prerogative here. And since Karen, you were the last speaker, I just have 2 things I'd like you to address. One is 8 miles, a pretty aspirational undertaking when you're starting from scratch. So it's a lot of real estate. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what was there before you began to make your intervention? And secondly, you mentioned a couple of times connecting a variety of downtown neighborhoods. Can you explain, is that those districts within downtown or age neighborhoods, or sort of what you mean by downtown neighborhoods? That's
a loaded question that if you asked 10 people in Indianapolis, you'd get 10 different answers. I think to answer your first question, so 8 miles is a lot. And again, we're under construction for 2 more miles now. so it's going to get bigger. But the key with the beginning was it was built in segments. And so there was never a time where 8 miles of downtown real estate was under construction at once. And even now with our 2 miles, I will tell you, it does a lot having 2 miles under construction at once, because of all the people you're impacting with construction. But from a 10, 15 years ago, when the initial segment was designed, it was done very intentionally on not a main street. So it was a street that had people for sure. It had 4 lanes of traffic plus parking. So there was space to give, but there really wasn't much on this street, not many businesses to complain, not many residents to say, what are you doing? And so that was done very intentionally, is to let's make this impact in a place that we're not going to have many naysayers. And again, I think what's also interesting to think about is the idea for the cultural trail is, 20 years old, a little bit more at this point. And so there was no example to point to say, what is this? And so it was, sure, you want to build a nice sidewalk? Great. We have a broken sidewalk as it is. So, we don't have any lighting. So sure, go ahead and build a nice sidewalk. And also, but being very intentional with where the construction started and how the construction was phased, so that you had people who had bought into proof of concept and could see the transformative nature of the cultural trail, both physically, but I also, just mentally, what does this mean if you take up a lane of traffic? You could go to a place in town, it was a half-mile segment, and see what that meant. People could kick the tires and allow them to get excited for it. There were definitely naysayers, especially people who thought they might lose parking, and there's still one particular area, one of the neighborhoods, one of the cultural districts. So even now, post-pandemic, there's a big tension. This particular area, Massachusetts Avenue, is probably the oldest cultural district in Indianapolis. Cultural district meaning it had high influx of art galleries and theaters and music venues, and the cultural trail brought the public art with it. And the business owners there at the time didn't want the cultural trail to go straight down the street because, again, they would have lost parking. So instead, the cultural trail kind of meanders its way through the neighborhood to make it to the end of the avenue. And that's different because on another section where there were no businesses, where a lot of those photos I showed of like a vacant parking lot with a new building, or a boarded up building with a new building, there was no one there. And so they just went straight down the road. And there's some people on Mass Ave say, we should have done it that way. We should have had the cultural trail going straight down Massachusetts Avenue instead of winding around. But because it winds around, it's made it truly a neighborhood feel, which is really special. And I will just say one last thing about that corridor is, in the pandemic, people experimented with closing streets down, right? Taking parking for outdoor dining. And there's that same tension in this one avenue, this one cultural district now. Some people wish that they would just close the street to cars and leave the outdoor dining. And then there's the other half that say, no, we depend on people who drive in from the suburbs. We've got to make it easier for them to park. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that discussion in that particular cultural district. So what do we mean by cultural districts, Barry? So originally they were existing neighborhoods, but the cultural district program, which predated the cultural trail, was really done as a way to brand neighborhoods and brand places that had cultural assets like museums, like music venues, like art galleries, like theaters, so that you would know, from a visitor perspective, honestly, you would know where to go to get something else to do at night, right? So if you were in town for a conference, maybe you were in town for a meeting, a corporate meeting, you didn't really know where to go outside of the central business district. And for us, the central business district the city refers to it as the mile square. So we're a planned city. I saw a comment about we're grids too. Yes. So our mile square, about half of that is probably the central business district. And so these cultural districts, for the most part, with the exception of the one in the central business district, are on what we'd say the diagonals. If you think of the mile square as truly a square, the diagonals are really where the cultural districts are, and their neighborhoods. They're outside of what the mile square is, and that's what, again, most people can refer to as the central business district, but they're no more than a half mile. The farthest you would ever go is a mile from the downtown. So again, before the cultural trail, that felt really inaccessible by walking or biking, especially if you weren't exactly sure where you were going. You're just kind of meandering around downtown looking for these places. But the cultural trail provided that unified connection and made it a beautiful experience. So it didn't feel like you were walking a half mile. You know, in New York, half mile, you do that in your sleep. You don't even think about it. But in, you know, a Midwestern city, you're like, what, do you want me to walk a half mile? But if you make it that beautiful experience, that half mile goes by really quickly. And so now what we've seen is really, if the destination was at the end of that mile, for example, our Fountain Square, at the end of that mile was Fountain Square, you've got a flourishing neighborhood in between the Fountain Square area and the downtown now, where that's where most of those new developments have occurred. So long-winded answer, but I hope I answered your question.
That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca, you want to take some of the chat questions?
Yeah, following up. So Karin, thanks that you saw the grid rounded space question. There's also a question.
I'll answer that.
Go ahead.
So it's still a grid, right? I mean, the city, we didn't change the city grid by any means, but it is, you know, the grid was made for the cars. And so the cultural trail is able to have some of those softer lines because it's not made for the cars. And so I think some of the, even just little things like what we call our pedestrian plazas, which are kind of the gathering, the queuing areas when you get to intersections, that it allows you to have more than one person, you know, waiting to cross the street and on a bike and a wheelchair with a stroller, and there's room for people. And those have rounded edges, again, to make it more of a gathering place. Some of them have benches, some of them have trees, but it's just a rounded corner of an intersection to, again, make that a nicer experience with space. So you don't feel like if you know, have a half toe in the street, you're going to get run over by a car, because you feel safe to step back and you know that you've got enough space there. And then what I was saying earlier about kind of the diagonals and how one of our diagonals, it kind of moves around. That's because the businesses didn't want the trail. So it literally does move in a pattern through and across that street, but it does, because the businesses weren't interested at the time, allow it to have a more neighborhood kind of slow feel that does really wind its way around a neighborhood.
That might be part of the answer of the next question. Glenn asked, what was the process for getting the approvals to build the trail for objection of residents and businesses?
Good question. So again, going back, we're celebrating, we're in our 10th year of the completion of the cultural trail. And since it was built in segments, the construction started in 2007. And in 2007, our downtown was significantly different than it is now. And so what was the approval process? Well, the city had to be on board from the very, very beginning. So when the idea for the cultural trail came about, which came about through our Central Indiana Community Foundation, the city is your first conversation. It had to be the first conversation because it is all built on public right of way. So even today, if we want to do something, we approach our partners at the city. We work with trying to figure out how to streamline this, to be honest. So we work with pretty much someone in every department. And so we're talking to the mayor's office now about getting a liaison that can be the mayor's office designated cultural trail liaison, because we go through so many different departments to do what we do. And so the city had to be on board, and for the city to be on board, the Department of Public Works and their engineering department had to be on board. So there were a lot of traffic counts and studies done, and there was honestly a collective agreement that said, from an engineering perspective, you know, levels of service is a big phrase that people use with traffic engineering, and most engineers are trained to have levels of service, which means basically you can clear all the cars out as fast as you can. It's an old school of thought now. Now it's, how do we slow down traffic? How do we get people to stop and see these places where they want to linger? Downtowns, cities all over the place are converting one-way streets to two-way streets. We're adding in stop signs and traffic signals to make people stop, to make it safer for pedestrians. And so collectively, the team at DPW agreed that they would be okay with having a failing level of service at some roads. And so from an engineer, that's a big deal. But they saw the value in what the cultural trail was trying to achieve. And I think too, going back to, we were built, for better or worse, with a lot of wide roads because we were a planned city with many, many lanes of traffic that were all going in one direction. And so there was space to give. So it gave the engineers with DPW some solace that, okay, we got a lot of lanes. Like, let's see what happens if we lose one and go from 5 lanes to 4 lanes, right? Or from 4 lanes to 3 lanes.
Louisville is very similar in that regard, for sure.
So which is a good thing if you think about making transformative investments in public space and pedestrians. So I don't know if that answered the question. There was a lot of community engagement too. So I mean, it was not just the city saying yes. The city was the first person, the first group that had to say yes. And then it was having these amazing visuals and to really sell it to the residents. But again, back in the early 2000s, there were not that many residents in downtown, and there were not that many businesses in downtown the way they are today.
That's good to know. Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm sure we'll be doing a field trip to learn more specifics.
Happy to host.
Thank you. I want to give August a chance to comment. There were some back and forth about the Taylor Street apartments that I think just to give a little bit more information on how they were developed as a partnership and how that was done.
Yeah, absolutely. So I addressed this in the chat, but just for those who are still just kind of listening and not checking that. So the Taylor Street Apartments was a public-private partnership. The Chicago Housing Authority played a major role, obviously, in getting this project off the ground, but they partnered with a developer known as Related Midwest, so the Chicago Office of Related Companies. And that was what allowed the project to move forward into the degree of quality that it did. I think we all recognize that we really need to mobilize private capital to address the social infrastructure goals that our cities have at this point. Public investment is often not enough, and we need to find ways to open up new avenues for raising private capital. I'm sure Yuxiang can touch on that as well. So this public-private partnership, was critical. I think it's a critical tool for more cities to be looking at in terms of developing their huge asset often of these kind of vacant areas or underutilized or underactivated areas is to tap the private sector, put out, requests for proposals or requests for interest, and, prioritize, be really clear about the goals that you have for the development of that property. And the developers who are invested in those goals as well will show up. So Related Midwest, for example, if you do a little research online, you'll find that they've been committed to social and economic development in the communities that they work in for a really long time. They have really critical and clearly stated goals around working with minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, pursuing environmental and economic sustainability for the communities that they're building in. And there's other examples from other cities around the country that have done similar things where they're using their vacant land or their underutilized land and turning it into something that can serve a lot more residents, can serve a lot more purposes, and can really kind of leverage the private dollar and create a host of economic benefits. So that's the history behind that development. I encourage you to look it up and learn more.
If I can follow up, Augie, on that, the discussion that you hit upon a little bit in your comments. In the past, there often was a very clear distinction between private property and public property. What the developers paid for private property, even if they were plazas or things as part of their parcel, it was their property. And city, public sector, or foundations, or whatever, paid for public spaces and plazas and things. And even in terms of the thinking about their use, there tended to be pretty strong distinctions. People were in their offices to work, and then maybe they had lunch, they went out and sat in the park. But now, particularly since the pandemic, things are much more fluid, both in terms of how people use spaces and as Yuxiang pointed out, the value of these spaces. And just as an anecdote, Rebecca and I met last week or 2 weeks ago with a major property owner of an office building downtown. And he said, there's just so much I can do to attract tenants. I can offer free rent or, concessions or something. But really, the value of the attractiveness of my space is more now dependent upon the value of the public space surrounding it and the downtown environment, which I thought was pretty interesting. So as ULI represents a lot of private developers, but do you see a change in thinking about how the private sector now values their participation in creating these improvements to their social infrastructure around them?
I do, yeah. I think there's more and more developers who have understood, there's always been some, and there's, I think, more and more developers who have always understood that we can only succeed together, really. Obviously, real estate is traditionally thought of as a competitive environment, right? You're trying to make your building better than, those around you, or stand out to attract a unique user, or get higher rents, whatever it is. But unless we all invest in creating a strong neighborhood, none of those buildings will succeed. You could have the newest Class A office building with all the best amenities, the highest features, the best interior finishes, whatever it is. And if the neighborhood around it is deteriorating, it feels unsafe, it's not welcoming, it's not beautiful, it doesn't have access to the amenities that we want from our downtowns, no one will ever visit that building and no one will ever lease out those office spaces. So I think there's a growing understanding in the real estate world that unless we collectively invest in our future and bring people back to downtowns, no one will be able to succeed. So there's developers who have been leading that fight for a long time and are demonstrating what you can truly accomplish if you embed that into your development philosophy. And I think we can turn to those for examples.
We actually, oh, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go quickly. I'll just add another detail to that. When we work in the Californian city, San Jose, working on their downtown park planning, developers came to us saying that this is such an important park in downtown. They're so dilapidated. How can we contribute to make that better? Because they all understand that a greater large park increase their value. However, because the park is not privately owned, they actually do not have a direct mechanism to contribute to their improvements. So in that case, thinking about the structure of P3 and also thinking about like fiscal and also other policies that allow private owners to contribute to public amenities will be a key question. So thinking about, say, value capture mechanism, thinking about payment in lieu of taxes, thinking about conservancy structures, those are, like, say, the organizational arrangements where a lot of policy and also financial innovation can happen that can really strengthen the relationship between interested private parties and also underfunded public or nonprofit parties.
Yes, I would. We fortunately or unfortunately, there's two sides of this coin. We currently don't have any of those capabilities in Indianapolis. There's some things that our state government controls that make it difficult for some of those creative P3 partnerships to come to life. What I was going to add, so in cities where that's possible, wow. But what I was going to add is we definitely see the difference. We work with a lot of different developers along the cultural trail, and it's such a spectrum. We have local developers who understand and know the trail and approach us about what their development looks like and how it could interact with the trail. And we have no incentives to give them. The city, when they come through for their permits, will say, well, has the cultural trail signed off on this yet? Signed off is kind of a loose term that really means nothing, but means they have to at least talk to us before the city will give them their permit. But some are great. And then you can tell when there's an out-of-state developer who comes in saying, I am supposed to get a letter with your signature on it saying I can build this. Where's your letter with your signature? And it's like, well, interesting. We knew something was happening, but no one's reached out to us yet. Like, could you please share your designs with us? And how are you interacting with the cultural trail? And by the way, did you know that you're going to have to put it all back together because you're going to impact it during your construction? And we need to make sure that this trail can still be accessible and all of this. And they get really upset because they don't realize necessarily, especially out-of-town developers. I shouldn't say all out-of-town developers, but out-of-town developers who don't do the due diligence to find out the local kind of vibe and where they're developing. They're clearly developing that, or they bought that piece of property because the market was telling them this is where you need to be in Indianapolis. But because they're not as familiar with the local environment, they don't realize that the cultural trail is the reason why that's where the market is telling them. And so we have a lot of different discussions with those types of developers than we do with the ones who know what they're doing with the cultural trail, I should say. So it's a blessing and a curse.
So
I would say, go ahead, Barry.
No, go ahead, Augie.
I was just going to say, like anything else in the built environment, I think there's always a distinction between actors who see their role and responsibility in creating positive social and environmental and economic impact in our communities and folks who have not quite reached that realization. And I think what we try to do at the Urban Land Institute is lift up the examples of those folks who have prioritized that impact and can set out kind of case studies and project profiles, and even down to things like, how did I make this deal work? What are the financials? What are the incentives I had to use? What are the tax credits I had to use? So we can kind of provide that education to the real estate community and to the built environment at large, so folks can see that this is not only the right thing to do for our communities, but it is economically feasible and it actually supports your bottom line. And we've documented pretty clearly that positive social impact is behind a stronger financial position for all of us, really. And that's kind of what builds these resilient places.
So Barry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This made me think, Augie, and some of the things that you showed, my question was, are those places truly public, or are they only accessible to the people who live in that development or who look a certain way if it's one of those interior lobby examples? Because that's something that we've definitely, during and post-pandemic, there's a lot of conversation about who is where in downtown Indianapolis. And I know we're not unique with that, but as a very public entity who feels pretty strongly that the cultural trail should be accessible and usable by everybody, we go toe-to-toe sometimes with a lot of the private developers who think that only certain people should be in certain places at certain times. So if you could speak to kind of that truly public nature of some of the examples you gave, that's the question I had.
100%. It's a question I get all the time when I'm speaking about social infrastructure. That's the main concern, is that folks feel like, developers will build this for the folks that they know will be, paying them to live in the spaces or to rent those spaces. And I think there's, on the flip side, actually pretty fantastic examples of places where they are fully public. This Taylor Street Apartments that I spoke about, that is a public library. It's accessible to anyone in the neighborhood. It serves thousands of residents. It attracts, people from all over the city. We've also documented examples of master plan communities, for example, by developers like the Howard Hughes Corporation. Master plan community, it brings to mind a gated community. It's, one of those stereotypically examples lifted up of places that are for residents only. But they've invested really carefully and considerately in public parks. And they've, one of their communities in Texas, known as the Bridgelands, has like a couple 100-acre park that has, kayaking, bird watching. It has wetland features. It has all kinds of events and programming, and it's completely open to the public. It has ended up becoming kind of a regional attraction and serves folks from all over the county and beyond. And there's plenty of examples, I think, of places that have invested in things like outdoor plazas with landscaping and high quality programming and events that are completely public. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to how we are all kind of working together to make sure that these spaces are not just for the folks who are living there and being served by the development itself, but are explicitly open from the start, and how we're using our programming and our activation and our sense of public safety to make sure everyone feels welcome and included in the space.
So I noticed there's been a couple of questions or comments about groceries and markets, and that's a question we all get, and we all know is a challenge because groceries and markets follow rooftops, follow residential units. So Karan, can you talk a little bit about the impact of the trail, as much as you can make that connection between additional residential development along the trail?
And can I just say one thing before you answer that? We're heading up against time, so people may drop off. We will send these questions around to the panelists and share everything with everyone who's on this call. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
That's okay. And I'm seeing this other question. No, there's not. The cultural trail is the transit loop in downtown. There are transit options, but within a downtown circulator, the cultural trail or the bike share program, honestly, is how people get around once you're in downtown. The question about grocery stores. So one of them, the longest standing grocery store in downtown was on the cultural trail. It's in an old Sears building. That was on the trail. It was on that first leg of where the cultural trail was built. And I think that honestly had to do with a lot of the early success, because people could actually walk to get their groceries, which is such a novel concept. But they really enjoyed doing it. And I don't think that was strategic. Let's put it on the street where the one grocery store is, but I think that was an added benefit of having it on that street. But that street also has another grocery store. That's where the Whole Foods is now. And Whole Foods, that means a lot when you say you have Whole Foods in your neighborhood, and both good and bad. But they both are thriving. There's that many people in downtown from a residential standpoint now. And these are not, I would say, going back to that question is, what is the downtown central business district versus the residential area? These are definitely in the residential areas. These neighborhoods are, these two grocery stores are. A third that has since gone in is not on the cultural trail, and it is close to IUPUI, our university in downtown. So it's between the university and the central business district. Again, all these things are not more than a half mile away from each other. It's very easy to get to all of them, but they're definitely in the residential areas of town.
Great.
I don't know if we have time for one more question, but if we do, just let me know. And if we don't, totally fine.
And maybe this is a good way to end it because it's a sort of a universal question. So you, and I guess Augie, you mentioned, I like the slide that you had up that showed sort of the 4 or 5 or 6 different ways that a strong social infrastructure adds value to a community. And Yuxiang talked about an additional one that deals with the actual economic aspect. But one of the things you mentioned was providing a place where communities come together, after an event. And it could be a celebration, when a sports team wins a title, or it could be to grieve together when there's a shooting or some things. And in lots of cities, there is a place that sort of instinctively people know it's the place where we come together. It could be a park. It could be a plaza like Fountain Square in Cincinnati, or Monument Square in Indianapolis. But it's a place that people sort of know. They don't have to be told to come there. They know that's where the community is going to come together. And we don't really have that in downtown Louisville. We had a shooting here in the spring, a horrible thing happened in downtown. We knew a lot of the people. One of the people who was killed was on Rebecca's board. The community, the response by the community was, overwhelming in terms of support and so community grief. Louisville's a very compassionate city, so they were, vigils and funds set up, and people put flowers at the side of the event, but we don't have a sort of a place. And I guess the question is, can you create those places where they don't exist, or can you use a number of smaller spaces to serve that same purpose? This is really for all of you.
That's a great question.
Barry, can I ask that we send that around and get some written responses from everybody? Because I'm afraid we're going to be losing people that won't get the benefit of hearing this. We're at time. It's 11:30.
Okay.
I would say you can create them. People just need to know where they are. Or maybe you have them. People just don't know where they are. From a leadership perspective, that's an opportunity.
One thing we didn't talk about, and again, we're out of time, but we were particularly curious, I guess that's the right word, Karen, about the experiment on Monument Square this summer to close it down to cars. So we might want to pick your brain a little bit about how that has worked and what the responses.
Yeah, sure.
That was awesome. That was totally awesome.
All right, Rebecca.
Okay. I hate cutting things short. We could talk about this for hours, I know. So thank you to our panelists and to Barry. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to everyone who signed up and registered to listen in and be a part of a discussion about the future of our downtown and what we can do to make it better. We will be having a third one of these, so stay tuned for more information. And to our panelists, I know that we'll be talking with you again. So thank you so much.
And Rebecca, could you just mention that this will be posted, the recording of this will be on the Downtown Partnership's website?
You just did. It will be. We will need to shrink it down a little bit, and it will have it on our website. And as well, we'll send out the link to that to all of the participants.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.